Brothers and sisters, let us begin with a story that is not told in whispers, but in thunder. Imagine a treasure not stolen in the shadows of night, but seized under the bright glare of the sun. A shipment of gold, mined from the red earth of Burkina Faso, worth hundreds of millions, never reached its destination. No storm delayed it. No pirates hijacked it. It was politics. It was power. And it was pressure from Washington itself. When the voice of Donald Trump rang out, sharp and unapologetic, declaring, "Africa must pay its dues," the world understood. This was no business dispute. This was a challenge to the very dignity of a people. And in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré felt the quake of betrayal. This story is not about coins or contracts, it is about sovereignty. It is about whether Africa owns tomorrow or is still shackled to yesterday's debts. Stay with me, because what began with one shipment of gold would rise into a storm of fire, faith, and defiance. Before we dive deeper, do not forget, subscribe, stay connected, and let your voice join this journey of truth. Beloved friends, hear this truth. The story begins not with silence, but with a thunderclap, a shipment of gold, the very fruit of the land of Burkina Faso, mined by calloused hands, washed in sweat and hope, was placed inside containers and sent toward the ports of Europe. It was no ordinary cargo. It was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, enough to build schools, to stock hospitals, to pave roads, to fill the bellies of hungry children. That gold was not mere metal. It was tomorrow itself. But tomorrow was stolen before it could arrive. At a European port, those containers were seized. No law court was called. No judge gave a ruling. There was no accident, no storm, no piracy on the sea. No, my brothers and sisters, it was politics. It was power. It was pressure, straight from Washington. And then came that voice across the airwaves, the voice of Donald Trump, sharp, cold, unapologetic. He declared that if Africa wanted access to global markets, then Africa must pay its dues. His words cut like a knife, and they fell heavy upon Ouagadougou, where President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his palace. The gold of his people, the treasure of his soil, was no longer in his hands. It had been turned into collateral, a pawn in a game written far from African lands, written in Washington and in Paris. The news spread like wildfire. Radios carried it across the countryside. WhatsApp messages leapt from phone to phone. Loudspeakers in crowded markets echoed the same bitter truth. Africa's wealth had been seized in broad daylight. Mothers who could not afford bread raised their voices. Miners lifted their tools in protest. Farmers shook their heads in disbelief. "They steal in daylight and call it law," shouted one man at a rally. It was not simply money at stake. It was dignity. It was sovereignty. For decades, loans tied to the International Monetary Fund had drained more than they had ever given. Debts signed under colonial terms, debts inherited from regimes long gone, debts that had never fed the hungry or healed the sick. These debts had now been tied like chains around Burkina Faso's future. President Traoré stood before his cabinet. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words filled the chamber. This is not about debt. This is about control. If they succeed, Africa will never own its tomorrow. Ministers looked at one another. Some urged compromise, repayment schedules, quiet negotiation, but others shook their heads, knowing this was not the time to bow. Outside, the people were already ahead of their leaders. Crowds filled the streets of Ouagadougou. Students staged sit-ins at universities. Miners marched from the goldfields with their tools held high like banners of resistance. Farmers, weary from toil, still found strength to shout, "Our gold is not your guarantee." Even soldiers in their barracks murmured, "If they can seize gold, what will they seize next?" The air in Burkina Faso was no longer filled with confusion. It was filled with anger, righteous anger. The kind of anger that does not fade, but hardens into determination. For the first time in years, the nation was not divided by tribe, nor by class, nor by age. It was united by humiliation. And in that unity, something new was being born. But while the streets thundered, the halls of power in Washington were quiet, deliberate. Officials knew the seizure was not a mistake. It was a message that Africa's resources were not truly its own. A message that if Burkina Faso and its allies dared to turn toward BRICS, dared to find new partners beyond the reach of the IMF, then their wealth would be frozen before it left their shores. The lesson was cold. The lesson was clear. But the people of Burkina Faso were not ready to accept that lesson. No, beloved, they saw through the strategy, they recognized the theft, and they were ready to resist. And so, what began as one shipment of gold seized at a port was becoming something far larger. It was not just about the bars of metal stacked in crates. It was about sovereignty. It was about dignity. It was about the right to say, "This is ours, and no foreign hand will take it again." The spark had been lit, and sparks, when fanned by the wind of injustice, do not stay small. They grow. They spread. They become fire. And that fire was about to burn far beyond the streets of Ouagadougou. If a single shipment of gold could awaken a nation, what might happen when that same spark spread across a continent? Brothers and sisters, when gold was seized, the people did not fall silent. No, the streets of Ouagadougou roared. The city that had known the weight of poverty and the burden of history now trembled with a new kind of energy, resistance. Miners came forth from the dust and heat of the earth, carrying their tools aloft like swords in the sunlight. Their hands were rough, their clothes torn, but their spirits unbroken. They lifted their voices in defiance. "This gold is ours. This future is ours." Students, bold and restless, sat down in the universities, blocking gates and chanting slogans painted in red. No IMF chains, no stolen gold. Their books became banners. Their classrooms became meeting halls. They knew that knowledge without sovereignty is hollow, and freedom without dignity is an empty word. Farmers from the villages gathered, bringing baskets of grain not to sell, but to share with the crowds. "If they starve us," they said, "we will feed one another." Mothers with children on their hips raised their fists. Old men leaned on sticks, but marched anyway. The young and the old, the poor and the poor alike, all joined in one voice. "Our gold is not your guarantee." Even in the barracks, where discipline had long kept lips sealed, whispers grew louder. Soldiers muttered to one another, "If they can seize gold, what will they seize next? If they take our treasure today, will they take our land tomorrow?" The anger of the people was not wild chaos. It was focused, it was righteous, and it found its echo in the voice of President Ibrahim Traoré. He gathered his ministers once more, the room heavy with tension. Some urged caution. "We can negotiate," they pleaded. "Let us offer repayment. Let us find compromise." But others sat stiffly, knowing in their bones that compromise meant surrender. And then Traoré rose, His voice did not shake. It was not loud, but it was sharp, and it cut through fear like a blade. They want us to bow. They want us to pay debts we never chose, with gold mined by our blood. If we bend today, then tomorrow there will be nothing left to stand on. His words fell like stones into the silence, and ripples spread across the chamber. Ministers looked at one another and saw, perhaps for the first time, that this was not a dispute about loans or ledgers. It was a battle for sovereignty itself. Beyond Burkina Faso, the tremors reached other nations of the Sahel. Leaders of Mali, Niger, and Guinea listened closely. They too had seen their resources tied to debts written in foreign capitals. They too had suffered delays, seizures, and humiliations dressed up as law. They began to speak with one another, to send envoys, to whisper of a united stand, and in that whisper, an idea was born. Radical, dangerous, unthinkable, some said, but also inevitable. What if Africa stopped sending its gold through European ports? What if Africa built its own reserve, an African gold reserve, held not in Paris, not in Brussels, not in Washington, but on African soil, guarded by African hands? The idea spread faster than the fear. In the markets of Ouagadougou, murals began to appear, painted by youth with brushes dipped in defiance. Gold bars breaking free from chains, hands reaching out, not in supplication, but in strength. Farmers pledged to contribute, not only their labor, but their harvest, to support such a dream. Students posted messages across phones and screens: keep the gold, build the vault. Western governments dismissed it all as fantasy. One European official scoffed, "They do not have unity, they do not have the infrastructure." But what they underestimated was the one resource Africa had in abundance: determination. For the people of Burkina Faso were no longer asking, they were declaring. Their gold was no longer just metal. It had become a flag, a rallying cry, a symbol of defiance. And for President Ibrahim Traoré, this was no longer about recovering what was lost. It was about building what had never been built before, a future where Africa's wealth stayed in Africa's hands. But could such a vision survive the storm? For even as Africa began to rise in unity, the West was sharpening its weapons, not of steel, but of finance. Beloved, let me tell you, when the oppressed dare to stand, the powerful never clap in applause. No, they strike back. And so, when Burkina Faso lifted its head and said, "This gold is ours," the West responded not with dialogue, but with chains of another kind. Banks in Paris and Brussels froze. Accounts linked to the government. Insurance companies refused coverage for African shipments, claiming risk too high. Cargo bound for Asia was stopped and searched, held for weeks under the excuse of compliance. Even humanitarian aid shipments were delayed, as if bread and medicine themselves had become weapons of war. This was not an open battle. This was economic warfare, dressed in the suit and tie of financial regulation. The message was clear: resist us, and we will starve you. Challenge us, and we will suffocate your trade. Yet the people of Burkina Faso did not crumble. Instead, they braced themselves. Mothers told their children, "We will eat less, but we will eat in dignity." Farmers brought their harvest to city squares, sharing freely with neighbors, proving that solidarity could feed where markets refused. Students, hungry but unbowed, painted walls with messages of defiance. If they fear our unity, then unity must be our weapon. And then, beloved, came a shift. From the east, quiet but deliberate, came new voices. Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi. They did not scold. They did not threaten. Instead, they offered partnership. BRICS envoys arrived in Ouagadougou with proposals, direct purchases of gold, technology to refine and secure reserves within Africa, trade routes that bypassed European ports entirely. For President Ibrahim Traoré, this was confirmation. He told his cabinet, "They wanted to isolate us, but in trying to close one door, they have opened others." The vision of an African gold reserve, once dismissed as fantasy, began to look like survival. Economists in the region drafted plans for joint stockpiles of gold between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Engineers whispered of vaults built on African soil, guarded by African soldiers. Activists spoke of creating a people's fund, where every farmer, every miner, every citizen could contribute to a foundation of independence. But the West did not retreat. Their media sharpened its words. CNN spoke of reckless youth. European commentators called Traoré too young, too dangerous. London newspapers warned of famine, instability, even collapse. It was psychological warfare, words wielded like blades to pierce hope, to make the people doubt their own courage. Yet the opposite happened. In the streets, the more the West threatened, the more the people rallied. Demonstrations grew larger. Farmers pledged portions of their grain. Miners pledged days of unpaid labor for the reserve. Students flooded social media with a single message: if they fear it this much, then it must be our only hope. And then, brothers and sisters, came whispers of something darker. Leaked reports suggested that opposition groups were receiving unusual funding. Pamphlets appeared, accusing Traoré of selling Africa to foreign powers. Soldiers were offered secret promises of asylum and wealth if they turned against their leader. It was the old game of division, played again under the guise of democracy. But Traoré was not blind. He addressed the nation with steady resolve. They tried to starve us. They tried to silence us. Now they try to divide us, but we will not be broken. We will not be bought. His words fell upon the people like rain on dry soil. Neighborhoods organized watch groups. Students exposed false organizations. The Army High Command stood before cameras and declared, "Our loyalty is to the Republic, not to foreign hands." For every move of sabotage, the people answered with unity. For every act of economic strangulation, they answered with sacrifice. What was meant to crush them was making them stronger. What was meant to divide them was binding them tighter. Burkina Faso had lost its gold shipment, but in that loss, it had discovered its power. Could it be, beloved, that by seizing Africa's gold, the West had awakened Africa's soul? What do you think? Was this the turning point? Share your thoughts in the comments. Beloved friends, while the streets of Ouagadougou echoed with chants of defiance, the halls of Washington and Brussels buzzed with unease. To the West, this was never framed as justice or fairness. No, they called it stability. They called it the rule of law. But law, as written in their ledgers, was nothing more than control. In the United States, Donald Trump stood at his podium, his words sharp as ever. He told the world, "These young leaders think they can defy the rules, but if Africa wants a seat at the table of global trade, it must first learn to follow the law." His law was IMF contracts. His law was dollar dominance. And anything beyond it, he declared, was chaos. Western media echoed the same refrain. Commentators on television spoke of Ibrahim Traoré as reckless, too young, too fiery. London newspapers warned of famine, of collapse, of a Sahel dragged into ruin by pride. analysts in Paris said, "Without Western banks, their economies will suffocate." But beloved, the people of Africa heard another sound beneath those words, the sound of fear. For if the African gold reserve were truly impossible, why speak of it day after day? If it were only fantasy, why send sanctions? Why fund opposition? Why tighten the screws of financial war? No, their constant warnings revealed the truth. They were afraid. And then came the revelation that shifted the ground itself. A whistleblower in Europe leaked internal memos from a powerful bank. Those documents spoke plainly. The seizure of Burkina Faso's gold had not been the neutral act of regulation it was claimed to be. No, it was ordered under direct pressure from Washington. It was strategy, calculated and deliberate. One line burned itself into memory. Without control of their gold, IMF leverage will collapse. This cannot be allowed. When those words reached African radios, newspapers and phones, the effect was electric. What many had whispered was now written in ink. The theft was not about debt, it was about domination. President Traore addressed his people with measured fury. They said this was law. But law is not written in secret memos. Law is not theft in the night. They have confirmed what we already knew. This is not about debt. This is about control. Across the continent, the revelations spread like wildfire. In Mali, Niger, Guinea, voices rose. If they seize one of us, they seize all of us. For the first time, the narrative had shifted. Africa was no longer on the defensive. The West, caught with its hand in the vault, scrambled to justify its actions. But beloved, the question remained. Now that the mask was torn away, what path would Africa take? Would it stop at outrage or march boldly into a new future? Beloved, when truth is revealed, a people must choose. Will they bow again, or will they rise? In Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, the answer was already stirring in the hearts of men and women. Rise. The idea of an African gold reserve, once dismissed as a dream, now stood as a plan. Engineers whispered of vaults to be built deep in the Sahel, walls of steel and stone, guarded not by foreign contracts, but by African soldiers. Economists traced out joint reserves, where the gold of Burkina Faso, the uranium of Niger, the bauxite of Guinea, could be woven together into a shield against manipulation. Leaders of the alliance of Sahel states sat at tables once reserved for foreign bankers and declared, "If we keep our wealth here, then no hand abroad can seize it." But beloved, this was not only about vaults or ledgers, it was about dignity, for in the streets the people already believed. Farmers carried baskets of grain, saying, "We will support this dream even if sanctions bite." Students filled social media with a single chant, "Keep the gold, build the vault." Miners, weary yet proud, said, "From now on, our work builds Africa's strength." The West did not sit idle. Sanctions thickened, markets resisted, and voices abroad cried that this was reckless folly. But every warning only proved what Africans already knew. If their unity could shake the foundations of IMF control, then their path must indeed be powerful. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people, his voice steady as a rock. They thought our gold was collateral. But it is not collateral, it is freedom. And freedom does not beg, it builds. The crowd thundered. And across the continent, leaders who once hesitated now leaned in. For the first time in generations, Africa was not merely reacting to the West, it was planning for itself. Beloved, the journey is not finished. The reserve remains fragile, The storm of sanctions still rages, and whispers of sabotage linger in the shadows. But something irreversible has already taken root. The people have tasted unity, and once a person tastes it, they cannot forget it. And so the question remains, will Africa's gold truly become Africa's shield? Or will the old powers strike harder, desperate to crush the seed before it grows into a mighty tree? Beloved friends, we have walked together through fire and storm. We have seen how a single shipment of gold, seized in arrogance, became more than a scandal. It became a spark. It awakened people. It lit a flame across a continent. Burkina Faso lost its treasure that day, but in losing it, Africa discovered something greater: dignity, unity, conviction. What was meant to humiliate became the seed of sovereignty. What was meant to bury became the ground from which hope would rise. In Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Niamey, voices no longer whisper, they declare. Farmers pledge their harvest, students raise their banners, miners lift their tools, and leaders, once divided, now speak with one voice. Our gold is not your collateral. Our gold is our freedom. The West still threatens, still warns of collapse, still sends the chains of sanctions. But beloved, chains cannot bind people who have already broken free in their hearts. And when the spirit of freedom moves, no power on earth can stop it. This story is not finished. It is still being written in the markets, in the fields, in the halls of power. And every headline you read, every whisper of Ibrahim Traoré news is not just a report. It is a chapter in a larger book, the book of Africa's awakening. So I ask you, beloved, do you believe that Africa's gold can become Africa's shield? Do you believe that what began in Burkina Faso could reshape the destiny of nations? Tell me in the comments, for your voice is part of this story too. And before you leave, remember this. Share this message so others may see. And subscribe so you will never miss the journey of truth. Together, let us follow, not just the headlines of Ibrahim Traoré news, not just the stories of Burkina Faso news, but the movement of a continent that refuses to bow its head again. God bless Burkina Faso, God bless Africa, and God bless every heart that still believes in freedom.